Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about more legal wranglings in the cases involving corruption at the Illinois Statehouse and both sides of the debate over transgender individuals in women's locker rooms. I'll then join the Center Square investigative reporter Brett Rowland to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Are you looking for fair news coverage out of the nation's capital? Join the Center Square's editor-in-chief Dan McCaleb and DC Bureau Chief Casey Harper as they discuss all things coming out of Washington, D.C.
And as you said, I did a fact check on this because I really found it pretty misleading. Gas prices, yes, are down. But if you look at food prices, they increased.
No spin, just the news. Listen to the America in Focus podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. More recorded phone calls involving the case surrounding former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan could be revealed in federal court. The upcoming trial of former Madigan Chief of Staff and House Clerk Tim Mapes deals with charges Mapes lied to investigators. In court filings this week, Mapes moved to exclude some evidence. Prosecutors detailed the types of recordings they have and requesting Mapes' motion be denied. St. Xavier University professor David Parker said if the jury hears clear evidence of wrongdoing in such audio recordings, it could be damaging to the defense.
And especially when you're hearing that from somebody's own voice. I mean, how you sit there and say, they're going to say, I never said that. We just heard you say it. Or we just heard somebody substantiate it. It's not innuendos anymore, really.
Dozens of audio and video recordings were used in the ComEd 4 trial that resulted in guilty verdicts in the case alleging the utility curried favor from Madigan for favorable legislation. Madigan goes on trial in the case next spring. He has filed to have the case dismissed. Prosecutors responded, saying that Madigan's arguments are flimsy and Madigan ran a corrupt organization and enterprise, profiting his associates and himself. Meanwhile, a 16-year-old swimmer in Springfield says the YMCA dismissed her concerns of changing in the women's locker room with biological males present and ejected her from the swim team. During a news conference Thursday across the street from a YMCA facility in Springfield, Abigail Wheeler, the 16-year-old swimmer who raised objections, said she was uncomfortable changing in a locker room with a biological male present.
I was made to feel as though I was in the wrong. I was made to feel as though there was something wrong with me feeling uncomfortable changing in the women's locker room, where biological men were being allowed to undress in the same space as me and my underage teammates.
The YMCA says Abigail was not banned from the facility and that her father withdrew her and the family's membership. Dan Wheeler said they did withdraw, but only after Abigail was suspended for objecting that trans people are in the girls' locker room. He said that isn't the issue anyway, and neither is whether someone was exposed.
It's not whether a biological male is naked, whether a biological male is leering, whether a biological male has a camera out. It's the fact that there's a biological male in the girls' locker room.
Christina Newton, a transgender member of the YMCA, believes that they and another person were possibly the individuals Wheeler's concerned with.
We was both in our swimsuits, about ready to head to the pool, and we was just talking about my surgeries. That's it. We wasn't showing people our private stuff.
Newton said despite Wheeler feeling unsafe, they won't use a more private family area as Wheeler was urged to do.
No, I don't. Because we are females, bottom line. There's no biological or nothing to divide it. We are females, and that's how we are.
The Illinois Freedom Caucus took up the issue and said they'll fight at the Illinois Statehouse to protect women and girls in locker rooms and in sports. Those are the top stories of the week from Illinois. Find more online at americastalking.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's investigative reporter Brett Rowland. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Breaking news, that's what the Center Square does best. The stories other media outlets refuse to report, the Center Square's breaking them all the time. Stories about government waste and political spending, stories about partisan agendas that hijack your tax dollars. The Center Square has it all covered and delivers the biggest news to your inbox as it happens. Sign up now for your state Center Square newsletters at thecentersquare.com. That's thecentersquare.com.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Brett Rowland, investigative reporter for the Center Square, filling in for executive editor Dan McCaleb, who's traveling this week. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, associate Illinois editor and senior Capitol Bureau reporter. We are recording this on Thursday, July 13th. Greg, what are we going to be discussing today?
Brett, even though the state legislature has been out since late May, there's no shortage of really important stories that people need to know about, and I'm looking forward to unpacking some of the more crucial stories from education and choice in education to the issues of individuals in locker rooms feeling uncomfortable by others in locker rooms, to even the issues of what's happening with Chicago police and beyond. So there's a lot for us to talk about.
Let's start first with former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. There's a couple cases that are related to him that are still pending. Tell us about the latest news here.
Well, Brett, you know firsthand of the ComEd 4 trial that happened earlier this year. You were actually in the courtroom for a lot of that, and there were 4 guilty verdicts handed down in that case. And just on background, the case originated from a nearly decade-long investigation by prosecutors looking into allegations of corruption within the Statehouse. And they discovered that the utility ComEd was giving do-nothing jobs to associates of the former House Speaker in exchange for favorable legislation. And that premise played out in court, as you saw, with a lot of audio recordings and even undercover video recordings showing individuals who were charged in this case and ultimately found guilty discussing a variety of things. And of course, with those guilty verdicts, you have other trials still pending stemming from this, chief of which is the trial against the former House Speaker, Michael Madigan, and that's set for next spring in Chicago. But there's a second trial that's coming up next month, and that's of Madigan's former chief of staff and former House clerk, Timothy Mapes. And Mapes is charged with lying to investigators and obstructing justice. So he faces trial next month, and then you got the speaker facing 22 counts with a co-defendant who's already been found guilty in one of these cases, Michael McLean. They face those charges, racketeering and bribery and a variety of other charges, all part of that 22-count indictment alleging corruption at the Illinois Statehouse. So this week, what you have, and you've got filings that happen when the charges are filed, and then there's a response from the defendants, and then there's the legal wranglings that happen of, well, the defendant doesn't want this type of evidence presented in the case, so they make their motion to the court, and Timothy Mapes made that motion earlier this week that he wanted certain evidence essentially suppressed and excluded from the hearing, from the trial. And the prosecutors, they fired back and said, that motion should be dismissed. Here's why. And they laid out the anticipation that the jury's going to hear a lot more undercover audio and wiretap audio recordings of Mapes talking with McLean about, quote, the boss, and about having to, quote, report back in. And really showing, and the prosecutors are saying, the audio evidence they need to present to the jury shows that close relationship that Mapes had with McLean, knowing McLean was relaying messages back to Madigan. So that's why the prosecutors say they need all of this evidence, and they want a summary dismissal of Mapes's motion to exclude some of this evidence.
All right. Wow. So a lot's been happening. Going back to what's happening with Madigan's case. And so that's set for trial next spring. What's the latest legal wrangling on that one?
Very similar in kind of, I guess, just general terms to what happened this week with the Mapes case. So last month, Madigan motioned for the case to be dismissed. And then he motioned for clarity on what they call a bill of particulars. And he wanted to amend, essentially, what they're looking for prosecutors to ultimately prove. And Madigan also worked in a previous Supreme Court precedent, I believe, about, what constitutes political wrangling versus, corrupt bribery and how there's a difference between that. So Madigan's trying to inject that into this case. And while that's been anticipated, and I'm sure prosecutors anticipated that as well, Prosecution, they filed a reply to Madigan's motion, 150 some odd pages, where they essentially say Madigan's arguments here are flimsy and they should be dismissed because Madigan, they allege, was operating a corrupt enterprise for nearly a decade where he was working to not only benefit his associates through corrupt means, but also to line his own pockets. So you've got some court wranglings going on showing that these cases are very much alive. But the real question here, Brett, is what kinds of things are the state legislators going to do about the corruption that's now been proven and alleged at the Statehouse? Are they going to take any ethical stance? Are they going to pass more laws that allow for more teeth of corrupt actors or even alleged corrupt actors? That has yet to happen. Even after, in late April, when you had the ComEd 4 found guilty, legislators were in session. They didn't do that. They didn't act on any kind of ethics reforms. So I asked one of my sources who's an expert on corruption and white-collar crime, David Parker with St. Xavier University, and I asked him about, why aren't we going to see these ethics reforms? What do you think's tying that up? And he said ethics reforms can only go so far. He said what's really important is that these criminal prosecutions continue and they proceed, because what that's doing is it's showing that there is actual teeth in the law, and it hopefully will send a message, Parker says, to others who may be thinking of doing things corruptly, that there could be severe consequences. So a lot of conversation about ethics, a lot of conversation about corruption, still very much an important issue here in the state of Illinois.
Is there any indication of whether more ethics legislation could come up in the veto session?
Yeah, and for people who don't track how the state legislature works, they come in for the first part of the year until May, and then late May they adjourn spring session. Then they're done for the summer. They then come back in the fall for what's typically called fall veto session. Now, it's not just to deal with vetoes. They can pretty much deal with anything they want. The issue of ethics, will it come up? That's a great question. I have yet to see any committees posting that are saying, hey, we're going to deal with ethics. I have yet to see any Democrat leaders come out with news conferences saying, hey, we got to deal with these ethics. Really, there's been virtually no recognition by the majority Democrats at the Statehouse of even the ComEd 4 trial resulting in guilty verdicts, let alone their former leader, not just of the House, but also of the Democratic Party of Illinois, being under indictment. So will they address this in the fall? That still is yet to be seen.
And then next up is the Chicago Police Department. They've been busy. We've had some violent weekends in Chicago. What's the latest going on with Chicago Police?
Well, there's a couple of things, and I think one that's top of mind for people is the migrant crisis in Chicago, where migrants have been housed in some of the precincts, some of the actual police stations in Chicago, and that's been a drain on the resources there. They're looking for housing, but coming out of that, you have allegations that have surfaced that Chicago police officers engaged in inappropriate sexual relations with migrants, including impregnating a minor, according to the allegations. So they're contending with that right now, and you've got leaders from the governor to the mayor saying there needs to be swift investigation into this. But even the Chicago Police Union president, John Catanzara, he's pushing back, saying he's not sure that these are legitimate concerns because he points to the state's criminal justice reform measure, the Safety Act. And he says because the Safety Act allows for anonymous complaints to be filed, he believes that that could have a role in this. And he also is worried about, the legitimacy of these types of complaints and future complaints. So that's one thing that the Chicago Police Union's having to deal with, and that leaders in the city of Chicago are wanting to get to the bottom of. So that's a story to continue to watch. But another story that Chicago police are dealing with is last month, Mayor Brandon Johnson, new into office, he unilaterally gave teachers, because Chicago public schools are part of the city of Chicago, it's unique as opposed to the rest of the state where there are individual school boards for individual school districts separate from municipalities. Chicago controls Chicago public schools. So the city hall is where policies come from for Chicago Public Schools. Well, Johnson, coming from Chicago Public Schools, he unilaterally gave teachers 12 weeks of paid leave without negotiations or, collective bargaining or anything like that. So after that was made a couple of weeks ago, John Catanzaro with the Chicago Police Union, he said police want the same, and the mayor should just give that to them as they gave that to the teachers and as the rest of the city's workforce has. Well, the mayor's office hasn't said anything about this yet, but this week, John Catanzaro came out and said, actually it was last Friday, he said that they're preparing to go to court. They're going to take this to arbitration, and he's going to force the issue to get Chicago police officers 12 weeks of paid leave. So those are just a couple of the things that Chicago law enforcement are having to deal with on top of hot summer, violent crime, NASCAR coming to town, a tornado touching down, flash flooding. So the Chicago police definitely have their hands full.
All right, Greg. And then the other story that's come up this week that's made some national headlines is regarding the Springfield YMCA. Can you tell us what's been going on there?
Yeah, so this is an interesting story, not necessarily something that we cover all the time, but it really is becoming a Statehouse issue now, as members of the Illinois Freedom Caucus have injected themselves into this conversation. What are we talking about? We're talking about a 16-year-old girl, a swimmer with the Springfield YMCA, who left the team because she was uncomfortable that there were transgender individuals in the women's locker room with this 16-year-old and other minors changing in the women's locker room. So concerns were raised in late May that this was happening. It was circulating on social media. There wasn't a lot of specific information that was out. It was a lot of innuendo at that time. The YMCA, when I talked to them, their communications director said there's no substance to any of these allegations. They said the allegations range from, a 9-year-old being exposed to, others being touched. There were no legitimate allegations of this sort, they say. And then it kind of quieted down. But then earlier this week on Monday, Riley Gaines, who is a collegiate swimmer who recently testified to the U.S. Congress about protecting women's sports, she elevated this story of a 16-year-old girl in Springfield being kicked off the swim team because she objected to transgender individuals in the women's locker room. So that got elevated on social media by a national figure. And then the 16-year-old girl and her sister were interviewed on Fox News, on national syndicated cable TV. And you have the story now going nationwide, even to where Congresswoman Mary Miller from Illinois talked about it on the House floor this week as being alarmed by it. The YMCA, they pushed back and said that Abigail Wheeler, the 16-year-old girl in question here, she was not kept from competing on the team. Well, I just left a press conference here in Springfield here on Thursday when we were recording this. And Abigail, her family, her father were there talking about the story. And I had to get clarification because the YMCA says that the Wheelers withdrew their daughter from the swim team and they withdrew their membership from the YMCA when previously the language was that she was kicked out of the YMCA. So we had to get clarification on that. And Dan Wheeler, Abigail's father, he said that ultimately, the line of events that happened from when Abigail raised the issue was confronted by the swim coach saying that they can't do anything about it because of human rights concerns, is what the YMCA says. They don't discriminate. And then they said that Abigail would have to leave the facility and they would have to have a conference with her parents to discuss this further. So this is where you get an interesting, difference between the YMCA story and then the Wheeler family story. Because Dan Wheeler, the father, he says when the meeting was set up, he wanted to bring different representatives in to the meeting to have this discussion. He says the Y pushed back and said no. And then instead of moving forward with the meeting, he said, no, we're not going to have the meeting and I'm just going to withdraw from this whole thing. That particular protocol aside and who's right, who's wrong, was Abigail removed from the team or did they withdraw her from the team? That seems to be a sub issue here, because I think what's overarching is the concerns that the Wheelers have and that others have of people born males being able to not only compete in women's sports, but also to change in a woman's locker room, even if there are minor girls present. The news conference I just left, you of course had Illinois Freedom Caucus members there. Chris Miller, the wife of Mary Miller, he's the leader of the Illinois Freedom Caucus at the Illinois Statehouse. He said that they're going to push forward with this and they're no longer going to be silent. He criticized those wanting to push this gender ideology into schools, into other spaces, and says that they're not going to stand for it anymore. And then there was a lot of conversation as well about women's rights when it comes to sports and athletics and privacy, and maybe there will be an effort at the Illinois Statehouse to deal with this. That might be an uphill battle, as a lot of the policies that Illinois Democrats have put forth, even this most recent session, deals with protecting that space for transgender individuals, removing gendered language from state statutes, allowing for transgender individuals to change their driver's license, to change their birth certificate, and a variety of other things. So it might just be a war of words rather than actual policies being implemented, with Republicans being in the super minority. But Miller and others say this should not be a political issue, that women and young girls should be protected from trans individuals in locker rooms. And I did talk with an individual who believes that they were one of these trans individuals that Abigail was concerned about. They were here at the news conference, so I stopped and talked with them briefly afterwards. Which, by the way, there were dozens of supporters of Abigail at this news conference out in the heat across the street from the Springfield YMCA, and maybe a handful of counter demonstrators of sorts. No problems, anything like that. But I did approach and talked with a transgender individual who believes that they were one of the individuals Abigail was worried about, and I asked if they were in the room, in the locker room naked, and they said no, that was not the case. They were in their bathing suit, getting ready to go to the pool, and they were talking to another transgender individual about their surgeries. This trans individual person told me, and she said that there was no nudity or anything like that. So again, this is a national story. I don't think it's going to disappear anytime soon. I think that this is an issue that's only going to be elevated more and more as we see other instances of this, not just in Springfield, but elsewhere throughout the country.
All right. And then, Greg, there's also some new protections in place for migrants when it comes to rental housing and apartments. What's the latest from the Illinois Human Rights Act on this?
The Illinois Human Rights Act gets modified from time to time to include certain types of protected classes. And in the Illinois Human Rights Act now is the protected class of being a migrant. And what that ultimately means is some landlord associations are seeing this as a requirement for individuals who own property and rent it out to then rent it out to undocumented migrants. They've raised some concerns about this, and we've seen even national headlines focused on this issue. So this is going to be a space to watch closely as well. But we did talk with a group that builds properties, and they actually didn't see this as too big of an issue, saying that they may actually be able to use some of these migrants to help fill the workforce for construction jobs. But the bottom line is this is just another facet in the conversation about undocumented migrants in Illinois and the different types of benefits they're receiving, not just access to be able to rent and having a requirement for landlords to rent under the Human Rights Act, but also the hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer subsidies to pay for undocumented migrant health care.
Thank you, Greg, for your insight on all of these important stories. But that's all the time we have for this week. Listeners can keep up with stories and more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Brett Rowland. Thank you for listening.